Well, folks, leftist Senator Tina Smith announced earlier today that she will not be running for re-election in Minnesota's 2026 senatorial election that will take place. Now, the left is already lining up in the state of Minnesota to try and find as far left-wing radical lunatic Democrat that they can find to take her spot. Minnesota Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan will announce just a couple hours after Tina Smith announced that she wasn't running, that she will be running for the U.S. Senate seat, and so has Representative Ilhan Omar, who represents the 5th Congressional District in Minnesota that covers like Minneapolis, St. Paul, that area. But before we get into all of this, drop down below, hit that subscribe button, make sure you never miss another video from us ever again. Now, Minnesota's lieutenant governor had a falling out with Tim Walz, who obviously was on the failed presidential ticket with Kamala Harris in the 2024 election. And from what it sounds like, those two have not spoken. It sounds like she had made a lot of plans on what she was going to do after Tim Walz won the presidency. So it must have been the vice presidency. Must have been a really big shock to her when that didn't happen. But she immediately obviously had her eyes set on things higher than the lieutenant governor's office in Minnesota. Obviously, this is something that was pre-planned because she announced this within a few hours after Tina Smith, the crazy radical abortion Democrat who voted against the Laken Riley Act, said she would not seek re-election at this point. Now, this is going to set up an open race in Minnesota. So far, there have been 2 Senate Democrats that are up for re-election in 26 that have now announced that they will not be running. Obviously, Gary Peters of Michigan put Democrats in hot water in Michigan. That's going to be a highly contested seat. And now in Minnesota, I don't think Minnesota is going to be as contested of a seat, but as we know, Tim Scott, he's the head of the National Senatorial Republican, their committee that they have for running the Senate re-elections, had come out a couple days ago and said that, really the big targets are, for the Republicans, are Georgia, Michigan, New Hampshire. I would say at this point now, if Tina Smith is not running, I'd say really take a good look at Minnesota. Could Minnesota be in play to help the GOP get to their 55 or 56 seat majority? Hard to say at this point, obviously, just because you're not going to have an incumbent senator running there. It's going to make things more difficult. The Democrats are going to have a primary. They're going to have to spend a lot of money, use a lot of resources in that primary. And who knows, we could get someone like Keith Ellison or Ilhan Omar that comes out of there, which I think is going to radicalize a lot of people in Minnesota, even some of the centrist people who maybe vote for Tina Smith and the Amy Klobuchars. I don't know if Minnesota's ready for an Ilhan Omar. And if President Trump can enact his policies, specifically his domestic agenda, his domestic economic agenda, I really do believe that Minnesota could be in play for the Republicans. Now, as of right now, obviously the lieutenant governor's thrown her name in the ring. Multiple other people, Ilhan Omar, Representative Angie Craig from the 2nd Congressional District, I believe. Minnesota's Secretary of State, Steve Simon, has also been encouraged to run. Right now on the Republican side, major loser, former NBA player and activist Roy White, which he's an activist for a lot of good causes, don't get me wrong. His views just are not in line with the views of the majority of Minnesotans, and I don't think he's a good person to be running. Doesn't mean I don't disagree. It doesn't mean I disagree with him on a lot of his issues. I agree with him on a lot that he stands for. He's just not the right candidate for Minnesota. If the GOP is going to win this seat, they are going to need someone who's a little more moderate. Unfortunately, I don't think you're going to be able to get a MAGA Republican through on a statewide election in Minnesota. I just have a hard time seeing that happen as of right now. Things could change 2 years out. That's where I stand on it. I don't think you're going to get a MAGA Republican through the Senate or through this process to become a senator from Minnesota. Just don't see it happen. I think you're going to see someone much more like a Susan Collins, a Lisa Murkowski, someone who is going to fall in line 60, 65, maybe 70% of the time. But there are going to be some key issues that they in the GOP are not in lockstep with. But ultimately, you're going to get more yes votes than you are no votes. So you can either get a bunch of votes from you can either elect a Democrat or you can elect a moderate Republican. I really think those are the options. So the state GOP is really going to have a lot to think about and look at here. And so is the national Republicans. They're going to need to look at this and see, this could be a competitive race that could be run. As of right now, like I said, Royce White, State Senator Julie Coleman, and then Senator Karen Housley of Stillwater. Karen Housley, she ran against Tina Smith back, I believe it was in 2018 in the special election. Obviously Al Franken resigned his seat. Tina Smith, who was the lieutenant governor of Minnesota at the time, assumed that spot was appointed by Governor Mark Dayton. And Housley ran against her. Did not go very good. She lost by about 300,000 votes, I believe. So we're gonna see what happens. But let's take a look at the race right now. Like we said, Peggy Flanagan, Angie Craig, Keith Ellison, the radical leftist attorney general in Minnesota. Let's just take a look at his election history. He used to represent the 5th Congressional District where Ilhan Omar is right now. But let's look back at his election. Let's see. In 22 here. This was the closest election. He ran the closest election in the 2022 statewide elections in Minnesota. This was the smallest margins that Democrats won from any seat. They had the governor, secretary of state, attorney general that was up. I think they had the auditor who was up as well. But he ran he's not real popular in Minnesota. Obviously, he got 50% in 22. Now, I think you take it with a grain of salt. 22 was supposed to be this great year for Republicans, and really it was isolated to Florida. You saw the wave in Florida. You didn't see it around the rest of the country. I think with this strong 2 years of President Trump, I think this could be, the GOP's not going to win it by 10 points. Could they win it by a point or two? I think it's possible. Jim Schultz, who is a lawyer here in Minnesota, came within a point, less than a point, of winning the seat in a bad year for the GOP. In hindsight, was a bad year for the GOP in Minnesota. If Keith Ellison threw his name in the ring, which, Keith Ellison right now is currently trying to sue President Trump for revoking federal funds from institutions that are federally funded that perform gender transition and gender mutilation surgery. So let's just put that out there. That's currently the fight that this guy has is making sure that kids can mutilate themselves and cause irreversible harm to their bodies indefinitely. So we'll just leave that there. Also, Mayor of Minneapolis, Jacob Frey, Kelly Morrison, who is the recently elected representative for the Minnesota's 3rd Congressional District, Steve Simon, Ilhan Omar, Tim Walz. As of right now, Dean Phillips and the two big ones, Dean Phillips, Al Franken, have both said they're not going to run for it. Obviously, this was Al Franken's seat at one point, and then Melvin Carter, who was the St. Paul mayor, announced that he'd be running for re-election for the mayor of St. Paul, not for this Senate seat here. Now, on the Republican side, they don't have as deep of a bench as the Republicans do, and they're going to need to recruit someone. But as of right now, businessman Adam Schwartzy, who's a retired Navy SEAL, spent 21 years as a Navy SEAL, announced that he would be running. Let's take a listen.
Economy. Schools all across southeastern Minnesota are teaming up to put on unified sporting events all year long. ABC 6 News reporter Aiden Sarah spent the day in Austin to watch some hoops.
There has been nothing but net here at Austin.
I am sorry, what is this right here? That is not what we had jumped over to. Here we go. We'll try that one more time.
One candidate has already thrown his hat in the ring for Smith's seat. Just hours ago, Republican this man, Adam Schwartzy, officially announced his candidacy for the U.S. Senate. Schwartzy is both a decorated Marine and Navy SEAL veteran. His release states he wants to focus on securing the border, supporting law enforcement, and revitalizing the economy. Schools all across South.
Well, there you have it. Obviously, he's going to be most likely a conservative member. Don't really know anything about him. Definitely something we're going to need to look into and see. But then Julia Coleman, Karen Housley, obviously her husband played, I think he played for New York at Phil Housley. Let's see. He played for a lot of different people. Played defense from Minnesota, but Housley has been a state senator here in Minnesota for a little bit now, since 2013, so about a decade. Kristen Robbins, a state representative, Ryan Wilson, who's the attorney and nominee for the state auditor in 2022. Two people that have declined it, Tom Emmer, who is currently the House Majority Whip, represents Minnesota's 6th congressional district, and then former governor of Minnesota, Tim Pawlenty, who also ran for president in 2012. The bench is not very deep for the GOP right now. I think there's maybe better candidates out there than what we're seeing on this list here. I don't think Royce White's going to be the best. Julia Coleman or Karen Housley could be potential. There could be potential there. We're going to see how it goes. But ultimately, I think we're going to need a much more moderate Republican. Doesn't mean they need to be a pushover, but they are going to be a more moderate Republican if we're going to really have a good shot at winning this seat. Just like, Susan Collins in Maine. That most likely would be a seat held by Democrats, but she's held it since 97 because she's a more moderate, centrist Republican who's able to get a big chunk of Maine voters that are Democrats, that are independents, to vote for her when, they ultimately vote for Kamala Harris in a presidential election. We're going to see, obviously, past results for Republicans have not been wonderful. Back in 2020, businessman Jason Lewis, who also represented Congressional District 2 for 1 year before he was, for 2 years before he was beat by Angie Craig, ran for the seat against Tina Smith in 2020 when she was running to get a full 6 years as a senator. Lost by about 5 points to Smith by about 150,000 votes. Now, we're going to see third-party candidates may play a role. They've played a role the last 2 election cycles here in Minnesota. Back in 2018, Karen Housley, who has showed some public interest, like we said, in running, got beat pretty badly by Karen Housley, or by Tina Smith, by about 300,000 votes in what was a bad midterms for the Republicans across the board. I'll give it to them. But beat her by 10 points. This was Trump's first midterm. This will be Trump's second midterm now, so we could see something like this. It's just going to depend, like we said, on the domestic spending agenda, the domestic economic agenda. Is he going to be able to get, his tax cuts enacted? What are we going to see from the Republicans in Congress over the next 2 years, and really over the next 6 months, because it takes time for these policies to implement. But then back in 2014, obviously Al Franken, comfortable 11 points he won by here. Look at this again. Now, this is a real interesting race. This is a 3-way race between Dean Berkeley, Norm Coleman, who was the incumbent, and then Al Franken, separated by about 300 votes. Obviously, third party played a big role here, so this is how you could hope if you were a Republican, this is what you see. You see a strong Republican candidate. Obviously, Norm Coleman was a more moderate Republican from Minnesota. You have a good third-party presence there. You could see it be close. Obviously, now, Norm Coleman had held the seat before, beat out Walter Mondale, who had replaced Paul Wellstone, who died in a plane crash, I believe just days before, maybe even just weeks before the election. But otherwise, really has not been held by Republicans since 84, I believe. So, not a great history of Republicans winning here. But when they do, it's close, or there's a third party that's involved. But as of recent history, not been great. Then you can look at Amy Klobuchar's seat. Smoked Royce White. Like I said, nothing personally against him. I agree with a lot of his views. But just in Minnesota, a statewide race, just not the time or place. 2018, Amy Klobuchar just smoked, and I mean smoked, Jim Newberger by what? Almost 25 points here? Just ridiculous. 2012, once again, it just gets stronger. The further you go back for Amy Klobuchar, it just gets better and better for her. Just smoked another Republican. Another Republican just smoked by Amy Klobuchar. And then you get back to the Mark Dayton legacy, where he had won by about 5 points, but ultimately Amy Klobuchar is very popular here in Minnesota. I don't know why. I wish she wasn't. but she is. But that seat hasn't been held by a Republican who is the Republican Party of Minnesota. Hasn't been held since 1994, and then on the other seat it's been 2008. So we're gonna see this. This could be a very interesting election for the Republicans in Minnesota. They could choose to be smart, put a moderate person out there, or they could choose to put someone ultra MAGA, which it's just, and look, I don't disagree with their policies, but ultimately we want to win the state election. Now, I just like to throw this out there. If Ilhan Omar were to run, I think she'd get beaten. I don't think she'd get smoked, but I think she'd get beat in a statewide race. Let's just look at this. So, here's the Minnesota flag right here, the new one, after they changed it from our standard flag that we had for years and years and years. This is what our new flag looks like right here. You see that? Now, here's a picture of Somalia's flag. I just thought I'd like to point this out here for a second. Somalia's flag, Minnesota's flag. Somalia's flag, we were one of the top 3 states, I believe, to take in Somalian refugees under the Obama administration. So, just like to point that out. But ultimately, don't think that Ilhan Omar is going to do great in the presidential, in a senatorial race here in Minnesota. Just like I don't think someone like Royce White is going to do great. You have to be realistic about these races. Because look at this. Kamala Harris won 6 million votes, about 140,000, 130,000 over Trump in 24. Klobuchar smoked him. Outran Kamala Harris by what? 150, 140,000 votes. Royce White ran under President Trump by what? 300,000, 200,000 votes? Little over 230,000 votes. This needs to be evidence to the Republicans on the national level and at the state level. Do not mess around with this Senate seat. You need to be smart. We need to find a good, moderate Republican who's not going to be MAGA, who can win the seat, who's going to fall in line 60, 65, 70% of the time. If we go full MAGA in Minnesota with Republicans, it is not going to be good for the Republican Party. We're going to let someone like Peggy Flanagan or Ilhan Omar, which would be interesting to see. How would it be the extremes if you had a Royce White versus an Ilhan Omar? I still think Ilhan might win that race. I think it's going to be a close frickin' race. Or someone like Keith Ellison. I think that's going to be a really close race. But don't mess around with this. Pick a good, strong candidate. We're going to see over the coming days and weeks and probably months what the Republicans have to offer in the state of Minnesota. So let me know what your thoughts are down in the comments below on this open seat. Who do you think should run? Do you think on both sides, on the Democrat side and on the Republican side? And as always, hit that like button, share, and subscribe so you never miss another video from us again. Until next time, folks.